I want to bust some myths about creating color palettes. You might think that you need to have an artistic flair or an eye for design to create a good color palette, but that's not true. There are very specific rules and guidelines that you can learn to help you create great color palettes every time, even if you don't consider yourself an artistic person. You might have noticed a change in interface design over the last year or two. Many applications now come with a dark and a light theme. So which one's better? At the moment, even the experts disagree. So according to Nielsen Norman, for users with normal vision, light mode actually leads to better performance most of the time. But when we look at Google's material guidelines, they say that dark themes help to improve visual ergonomics by reducing eye strain, adjusting brightness to current lighting conditions, and facilitating screen use in dark environments. Dark themes also tend to conserve battery power because devices with OLED screens can turn off black pixels. On the right, you'll see an example of both light and dark themes for the XMPRO mobile app. So how do you actually create a color palette? I'm going to take you through two examples, one for a light theme and one for a dark theme. First, you want to start off with a primary color. This color can be your brand color or any particular color that you would like to include across the interface. One way that you can use this color is to include it as an accent to emphasize elements like buttons and links. Now let's look at semantic colors. These colors are used to show warnings, errors, success messages, and more information. Typically you have green, red, yellow, and blue, but this can be anything you want. Just remember that green is typically associated with success, red with an error, yellow with a warning, and blue with more information. But this can really vary based on your preferences. Then we have neutrals. I recommend having at least 3 options to work with for backgrounds, borders, and text. Finally, we have data visualization colors. These represent data in various formats. We've actually done an entire video dedicated to just this topic coming up in the next module. What you'll notice here is that the colors we've chosen are what is called visually equidistant from one another. This means that they are easy for you to distinguish between the various colors. Another thing to note is that the colors for the light palette can actually be quite saturated. There aren't a whole lot of constraints around saturation on a light theme, but that's very different when you create a dark theme. Now let's take a look at a dark color palette. Similar to the light theme, you'll choose a primary color, semantic colors, neutrals, and data visualization colors. And as I mentioned, if I flick between the light and dark palettes, you'll see that the dark palette is a lot less saturated. According to Google's material guidelines, using highly saturated colors on a dark background can actually create optical vibrations that make it difficult for users to read. One important thing that I haven't mentioned yet is that it's really important to consider accessibility when choosing a color palette. A good UI design is accessible to as many people as possible, and this includes low vision users. One way to help improve readability for users with vision restrictions is to use a contrast ratio, as recommended by the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So in this example on the right, you'll see the top card is much harder to read than the one beneath it. The typeface, font size, and font color are exactly the same. The only difference is the contrast between the background and foreground colors. So what are the contrast ratio guidelines? Well, for normal text, which is around 18 pixels in size, the guidelines recommend a contrast ratio of at least 4.5 to 1. For larger graphics and other interface components like icons, you need a contrast ratio of at least 3 to 1. This is especially important for dark themes. Now let's look at how we can improve usability for colorblind users. An important thing to do is to not rely on color alone when showing important messages like alerts or warnings. It's best practice to combine the use of a color with an icon, as you can see in the MailChimp example on the top right of the screen. Where possible, avoid using either red-green or blue-purple color combinations. This is quite difficult when you want to show green messages for success and red for warnings. But if you do decide to use those colors, it is important to add icons to those messages to help colorblind users understand what they mean. Another way that you can help these users with data visualizations is to use patterns and textures in your charts versus just solid colors. This will help them differentiate the various series in your data. Now let's take a look at what charts look like to colorblind users. There are many types of colorblindness, and this is just one example. But as you can see, the blue and purple become pretty much the same color in the colorblind version on the right. This was actually done using a colorblindness simulator that I've shared in the resources below, and I'll take you through in a second. Before we look at all the helpful color palette resources I've gathered for you, there are a few important considerations when it comes to creating dark UIs. Firstly, you want to use a dark gray rather than black as the primary background color for your dark UI. The background should also be dark enough to display white text, which means that it needs a good enough contrast ratio, ideally 4.5 to 1. You also need to add ample white space, or negative space in this case, between elements to give the design some breathing room. And as I mentioned earlier, you want to avoid using highly saturated colors because they can cause optical vibrations, and you need to be careful of overusing your accent colors on a dark theme. Now let's look at a few tools that you can use to help you generate color palettes, even if you're not a designer. The first one is called Palex. It's an automatic UI color palette generator, and what's great about this is you can add a base color. So let's say we have teal as our base color. We can update it and it'll give us a full spectrum color palette with various shades. This gives you a whole lot of options to work with. The next tool is called EVA Deep Learning Color Generator. So let's say I choose the same teal as my primary color. This will give me semantic colors based on the primary color that I used. I can even choose between a light or a dark theme. This is a really great free tool if you're looking for semantic colors that fit your primary color. Then we have the Material Design color tool from Google. Let's use that same teal again and then choose a secondary color. Google will generate light and dark shades for each of them. You can also export your palette and see whether the colors adhere to accessibility standards. Then we have the color blindness simulator that I mentioned before. So if you don't have a color vision deficiency, it can be very difficult to imagine what it's like for someone who does. What you can do here is take a screenshot of your color palette and upload it to this area over here. You can then choose from different types of color deficiencies, and this will show you whether it's still accessible for users. Then we have a handy tool called the Color Contrast Checker at adasitecompliance.com. You enter a color into the foreground and another into the background, and it'll show you whether this actually passes the 4.5 to 1 or 3 to 1 recommendation ratios. So what do you do when the colors you have don't actually meet the requirements? Well, then you can use this last tool on the list, which is called the Accessible Color Generator by LearnUI.design. Enter the closest variation of the color you want to use and the color you want it to contrast against. This will give you a compliant color combination by generating the closest variation to the colors that you've given. Now in the next video, I'm going to teach you the basics of typography.